Hello, Kristen.
Hi, Bill. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to have you back. Last time I was on this show, I was the I don't know if I was the moderate, I guess. I think
I don't want you to ruin your entire career in 5 seconds.
I think at the end of the show, Matt and I conceded that the things we had said had probably prevented either of us from ever running for public office. So the damage is done.
But I thought it was, if you haven't caught it yet, and particularly if you're on the left and you think that it is impossible to find a thoughtful conversation between two conservatives that's candid and frank, I would recommend it highly.
Oh, thanks, Bill. I appreciate it.
No problem. Now, in this week, the biggest political story, arguably, is the special election in the Buffalo-Rochester area in western New York, when a reliably Republican district fell to the Democrats. Some different interpretations why that is, but I would say the consensus is that Medicare was the main reason why the Republican was not able to get footing, because she embraced the House Republican budget, which effectively would dismantle the program, and the Democrat exploited that to her full extent. How is the conservative blogosphere reacting to this? Are they taking the Newt Gingrich of 7 days ago position that maybe this is too far too fast? Or are they just blaming the messengers that they didn't argue for it well enough and they let the supporters twist in the wind? What's the overall sense?
So the overall sense is that the Republicans have not found an effective way to talk about the Medicare plan, and so we're constantly on the defense, and that's not very good. But then you have other bloggers that are also saying, but this wasn't entirely about Medicare. In this race, you had a man running as a Tea Party candidate who had run as a Democrat. This is the 4th time he's run for the seat, and in previous times has run as a Democrat. Was sort of almost a guy who would be to the left of where the Democrat in the race was. So if you add together the Tea Party candidate and the Republican, you get like 52%. So there's a lot of belief there was a spoiler in this race.
So it is presuming that all of his votes would go to the Republican.
Right.
Kind of a jump.
But I mean, you needed, for some, how many Democrats were out there saying, I'm going to vote for this Tea Party candidate? I mean, like, let's be realistic. I guess if they remembered that this guy was previously a Democrat, I'm not sure. But
one of his main issues was trade. Mm-hmm. And China, mm-hmm. which has cross ideological appeal. So I think there's an argument there that you had some, kind of Reagan Democrats, if you will, who might be concerned with a lot of things, but also don't want their Medicare messed with. Mm-hmm. But that's why I think it's a little harder to pin this all on the third party aspect.
Yes, well, and not entirely. I mean, and the other thing is Republicans have not necessarily been great at these special elections. You had the Mark Kritz seat, which was the former Murtha seat in Pennsylvania, where, Republicans, by all accounts, should have done decently well in that district and just couldn't pull it off. So there's a post from Nick Gillespie, though, at Hit and Run, which is the blog over at Reason, where he says, one clear lesson that is the least mentioned: if your party vacates a seat because the conservative married incumbent was caught trolling for chicks via Craigslist, you've got a real problem on your hands. You'd have thought that lesson would be learned after the Mark Foley scandal, when MAF 54's seat turned Dem after the Republican incumbent resigned after cyber-stalking congressional pages. But that first truth is the one the commentariat will be least interested in. And that's kind of true. I mean, that's, of all the posts that I read, very few of them pointed to the incumbent Republican left due to a sex scandal. So maybe that'll hurt your party too. But I think Michael Barone over at the Examiner had a good take. He said, yes, there are special factors that hurt Republicans here, including Davis's candidacy and his endorsement by David Belavia, an Iraq War veteran who was disappointed he didn't receive the Republican nomination. Another problem was candidate quality. Jane Corwin, by her own admission, did not respond sufficiently to the attacks on Paul Ryan's Medicare plan. She was a rich woman who looked like a China doll rich woman running in a district better suited to a rough-hewn candidate. And John McCormick at the Weekly Standard says, well, how good are these results for Democrats? It's always good to win another House seat, even though this one may be wiped off the map during redistricting. But it's not clear that the Democrats' share of the vote is all that impressive or significant, given the election was precipitated by Republican Congressman Chris Lee's Craigslist sex scandal and ensuing resignation, and that Republicans remained divided throughout the race. And this isn't the first time, again, that in New York, Republicans have had problems with these special elections. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that in New York, there's no primary to, like, suss out who the best candidate is for the district. It's usually a committee of whoever the county folks, sort of the local Republican kingmakers choose who they think is the best candidate. And you ran into a lot of problems. This was the whole Dee Dee Scozzafava issue last go-round in another sort of prominent Republican special election that did not go so well, with Doug Hoffman and versus Dee Dee, and she got chosen, but was she really conservative enough? Medicare is not, so a lot of these posts, I think, downplay how important the Medicare issue was. It was about the candidate, or it was about the Republican left office in a sex scandal. But there is an acknowledgement that Republicans have to get better at talking about Medicare, and that right now we're very much on the defense. And as long as our talking point is, we promise we don't want to destroy Medicare, that's not really successful because, Democrats really only need to keep saying that over and over and over again. If we don't have a good retort and just remain on the defense in sort of weak way, there is a chance this could persist.
And there certainly are folks on the left saying that the right is being incapable of accepting that they're just holding a weak hand or taking this position. You have David Neward at Crooks and Liars saying if these people were competent in the least, they'd realize that their ideological rigidity had taken them out onto political thin ice and it was cracking away underneath them. Newt Gingrich showed a flash of this when he tried to distance himself from the Ryan plan, and then, of course, came quickly to whimpering heel. So onward they plunge. Earlier this week, Charles Krauthammer and Jenna Goldberg were on Fox extolling Ryan's many virtues and pleading with him to get into the race for the Republican nomination for president. Both of them thought Ryan should be drafted if he didn't run off his own. And even after this disaster, their tune will not change one iota. And Jonathan Chait at the New Republic surmised that Republicans took the wrong lesson from their success beating up on the president's health care plan in the November 2010 elections, thinking that it was because they hated the liberal ideas that Obama had, therefore they would embrace conservative ideas for Medicare, when, as Chait argues, people just don't want changes in Medicare. So anything that smacks of a change is unnerving to, especially the seniors. Mm-hmm. So when Republicans ran on Obama's going to cut your Medicare, which they did in 2010, that worked. But now that Democrats are running on, now Republicans want to cut your Medicare, that's also going to work. And so Chait ends by saying what they haven't figured out is that their Medicare argument only works when they flank Democrats to the left, not when they go to the right. So in that analysis, it's not a question of messaging; it's a question of the position itself that is impossible to sell.
Well, you started seeing some Republican staffers. Brad Dayspring is the press secretary for Cantor. He's in my Twitter feed, and so he started going on the offense. I've noticed and this is a point that's brought up by Con Carroll over at the blog at the Examiner, the Beltway Confidential blog, where he says, quote, "Republicans cannot keep playing defense on Medicare and hope voters will see the light. They need to aggressively go negative on the Democrats' failure to produce a viable Medicare plan. They need to explain how this will hurt seniors and that the pain is coming a lot sooner than they think." And all of the Brad Dayspring tweets have been basically, okay, so this is the Republican plan. The Democrats' plan is for Medicare to go bankrupt because they don't have another plan, and that's what's going to happen. So what is the other plan? Sort of knowing that any Democratic plan to address Medicare might involve increasing Medicare taxes or, getting rid of the cap on the payroll tax or what have you. That assumption sort of loaded in there, and then this becomes a politically better point for the Republicans.
Now, there was this Politico story this week which said that there was polling done by Republican pollsters internally before the House budget vote was taken, where the pollsters told the party leaders, look, we've tried the best spin that we have. And I believe it was along the lines of what Khan is talking about there. Look, this Medicare is going away anyway, so we're just trying to save it. And they're like, no matter how we spin this just does not pull. People don't believe that Medicare is just going to fade into thin air if we do nothing, and therefore this is the only recourse. Usually it's conservatives saying liberals, if you're explaining, you're losing. Mm-hmm. So what's making people think that they can sell that kind of argument when there's clearly no, at least innate appetite for that kind of argument.
Well, I think that the idea is that if it was ever going to work, now's the time. At least politically, if you're riding on this wave of 2010 Tea Party energy and you have deficits in spending that are this critical issue, and you layer this in with a debt ceiling vote, and you've got the government that almost shut down, that all of this together creates a unique moment where if you were ever going to really reform entitlements, and the political environment was ever going to be at a place where you could say, sorry, we're all going to have to sacrifice and this cut's going to have to happen or else taxes are going to have to go up, that this is the time. And so, the polling on this is not great. It's dangerous, but if the issue is when it's just about Medicare, it's really challenging for Republicans to win. When you expand it out and Republicans come back with things about the need to reform the way government works, deficit spending, it's a little bit better. So when we're just constantly, no, Democrats are lying about us, that's defense, and that's not making Republican arguments better. And this is actually sort of moving on to the broader budget issue, and with this, Peter Suderman at Hit and Run, I think, makes a good point, where he says, he had a post where he says, it's not that entitlements don't need reforming, they do. Instead, the problem is that the political groundwork for a Ryan-style overhaul hasn't been laid. Even in the most favorable possible circumstances, say, for example, Democrats declined to play the granny card and instead agreed Medicare needs fixing somehow, no major Medicare overhaul was ever going to get through the Senate this year, and voters were almost certain to be nervous about any plan to substantially alter the system's basic functionality. But House Republicans went ahead and voted for the Ryan plan anyway, thinking that this was their moment, their turn. So it was that disconnect. That it was the idea that, Barack Obama's in the White House. We don't control the Senate. So there was always sort of an acceptance that the Ryan plan was, I think Megan McArdle referred to it as, this was the initial offer. This was like the first step. But once it got out there, you have these 80-some-odd freshmen for whom this isn't an initial offer. This is the bill they want passed. And they don't, they're trying not to repeat the sins of their predecessors in becoming too squishy on fiscal issues and not being conservative enough. I mean, it really goes back to, do you believe that Republican success is because you rallied the Tea Party, or is it because you won independence on economic issues? And based on whatever your perception is as to why Republicans did so well in 2010, that feeds a lot of your decision-making. And it's clear that Ryan and the folks behind the Ryan budget believe this is the unique moment. And you saw a lot of that, too, with the reaction to Newt Gingrich's Meet the Press comment. He didn't get a lot of folks that sort of jumped on board with him and said, you're right, maybe this wasn't a plan that was crafted to pull in a broad-based coalition. Instead, you had voters going up to him in Iowa saying, hey, you stabbed Paul Ryan in the back, get out of my face. So I think there's a belief, too, that there's eventually going to be this groundswell of people or that Paul Ryan has a big enough of a fan club that will radiate out and re-energize the Tea Party to stave off any independent defections that might be caused by a lack of popularity in this plan.
One other Medicare point before we talk about sort of the broader budget issues, even though there was a lot of celebrating on the left for this victory, and a sense of evidence that the Republican argument just doesn't work when the rubber hits the road, you had some criticism, both from, and there still are, pro-Obama camps and pro-Clinton camps, for some of the residual fallout from the 2008 primary, about how Democrats should react to this. John Aravosis at America Blog took a whack at President Obama, saying Obama's statement on New York victory fails to mention health care. He's just sort of generally celebratory, but didn't credit Medicare with the victory. And Aravosis said, this is pathetically naive. This man simply has no fight in him. He also doesn't understand the first thing about politics. Obama's primary interest was making sure he didn't say anything that would help Democrats, because by helping Democrats, he's personally hurting Republicans, and hurting Republicans is mean, and he doesn't do mean. All sarcasm aside, we finally found a winning election. It's shown weakness of the GOP armor. The White House doesn't even mention it. So there's that sort of lingering concern there that President Obama, just for political optics reasons or for substantive reasons, still wants to cut deals with Republicans on these issues, isn't taking advantage of this moment. You also had over at Jack and Jill Politics a blog post attacking Bill Clinton, because Clinton was caught on camera at the Pete Peterson Deficit Summit, being very nice to Paul Ryan, although he had some critical things to say about Ryan's budget in his public remarks. He spoke to him privately afterwards and said that he hopes Democrats don't use this as an excuse not to do anything on Medicare, and told Paul Ryan they should give him a call and try to work things out together. And so Jack and Jill headline post was, Bill Clinton is at it again. This time it's Medicare. Bill Clinton has fooled many of us for many years. He brought on the DLC and gave Vichy Democrats cover to act like Republicans. So there's still a concern on the left that there's not unity in how to handle this political moment to make sure that Medicare is not damaged in all the budgetary and debt limit talks that are going on right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's, as far as Obama not having any sort of response, that's been another big conservative criticism when we go to the broader budget debate. In Congress, in the Senate this week, they voted on a variety of different budgets, and President Obama's budget did not fare so well. And this is a budget that had sort of been disowned by the Obama administration itself, I believe, that this wasn't even a budget that they had put it out and then immediately it had come under so much fire that even Democrats walked away from it. It got 0 votes in the Senate.
I would characterize that narrative a little differently.
Okay, well, no. Please characterize it as you will.
I mean, the president had his initial budget proposal, which he explicitly said upon its introduction, this does not have all of the deficit reduction pieces I think we need, but those other parts need to be negotiated in a bipartisan way. I'm not just going to put it out, by myself. And he then followed up on that with the speech he gave last month, which laid out his idea for a deficit trigger, which is not included in his original budget. So when the vote happened on Wednesday, there were joint votes, one on the House Republican budget and one on this other original Obama budget. The White House wasn't twisting anyone's arm saying, please don't embarrass me and don't vote against my budget. They all basically told the whole party, look, you don't need to vote on this. I'm not asking you to. It's not literally what I'm expecting to come out of the final negotiations. It's slightly bad optics-wise to have a 97-0 vote. I think it was just procedurally to say we're not going to take this up. It wasn't a literal vote on the budget directly. And when you have a vote like that, I think it's pretty clear that no one was arguing that this was the absolute line in the sand for Democrats.
Well, the point made by John Hendricker over at Powerline is, he says, today in what would be a major news story if the times we live in were not so bizarre, the Senate voted 97-0 against President Obama's fiscal year 2012 budget. Obama's budget was such a joke that not a single Democrat was willing to support it. One naturally asks, do the Democrats have something better to propose? The answer is no. The Democratic Senate has not come up with a budget in 2 years, that's a question that I think I've posed before, is Republicans have not controlled the House for the last, Republicans haven't controlled the House since 2006 and haven't controlled the Senate. Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi were running the show 2 years ago. I still continue to ask, what would be the problem with a Senate budget? I mean, I guess at this point, the idea is if you don't propose an alternative, you can just keep attacking the Republicans for the Medicare thing and just hope that's enough to coast you through. But I believe the latest tally is at something like 760 days or 770 days since Democrats have voted in favor of a budget.
Well, I think there's two separate things that have happened there. What happened in 2010 when Democrats controlled both houses. And this is my own personal opinion. This is not, it's been written anywhere. But you had a split in the Democratic Party, between the progressives and the blue dogs, or what should actually be in a budget. I think there's probably a lot of consternation on the blue dog side of things to have to affirmatively vote for anything that would contain some more debt, which any budget would have. Even the Paul Ryan budget adds to the debt. No one is suggesting you can completely turn around 360 degrees in a year. It's impossible. But politically speaking, to say I voted for a budget that added X trillion dollars to the debt over 5-10 years, that could be the recipe for a lot of attack ads. And so they were afraid to have to put their name on something direct as that, and so it was easier to say, let's not vote on an actual 5-year budget. Let's just fund through continuing resolutions, and that way the government doors stay open, and I don't have to have my name on the hook for a thing that could be twisted around that way. So you can call that lame or cowardly or whatever, but I think that's what the situation was in 2010. Whereas now, I think there was a different calculation that Obama, I'd have to say, played quite. I mean, so you can say 2010, they tried that and it didn't work anyway, so it was super stupid. This year, you could say Obama and the Democrats said, you know what? If we would love to have a deal, but we're only going to really get it if it's bipartisan. And if one side goes first, they're going to get their heads smacked from either side. So we're not going to go first. And hey, if you Republicans want to go first, you can have at it.
And we did.
And they did. And you are where you are. So I think the Democrats will take you haven't passed a budget charge over what Republicans have been going through over the past 2 months.
But I wonder to what extent that it will last. I mean, if Republicans have put forward a solution that is politically challenging, as the Ryan plan is, without having laid the groundwork properly, which the Suderman piece I referenced sort of goes on to outline the ways in which Democrats, having long wanted to reform healthcare, put in place like institutions and sort of had things ready to go so that when the big healthcare debate happened, there was a foundation for it. The policy had been back and forth, but we know this wasn't just one member of their chamber had come up with this plan and everybody jumps on and it went out to the public. The Democrats sort of had a better foundation for moving into their healthcare debate, while Republicans are now sort of, when you jump in the pool and it's really cold at first, and it's like, this is miserable. That's sort of the political shock that I think everybody's going through. And I think that as we get closer to next year's elections, and again, this could just be naive on my part, and I'm sure Democrats were probably saying similar things in 2009 about the healthcare bill, but eventually I think bigger issues will override this Medicare thing if economy stays bad, and if the debt and deficit issue becomes a huge, if for instance we bump up against the debt ceiling and things go really south and there's no deal because I think there's a vote to have a clean debt ceiling raised that's not gonna fly. The Medicare thing is challenging. So if Republicans can expand the debate back out to the broader, we have to do something or we're going to fall off the cliff. It's both. Both sides have scary arguments that are going to freak out voters, and I guess it's just which one will wind up freaking people out more.
Well, and that debt ceiling vote that you referenced there, the House is going to have a vote on a so-called clean debt ceiling, meaning no conditions, no spending cuts or tax increases attached to raising the debt limit. But the House Republicans are doing that explicitly, so it will fail, so they can go just as the Senate had the Ryan budget on the floor to say, look, your budget can't pass the Senate. So let's come back to the negotiating table and start putting some of these things off to the side. The House leadership wants to say, look, we can't do a clean debt ceiling because we tried and we've proved not only did Republicans not vote for it, but a number of Democrats didn't vote for it either, which is likely what's going to happen.
But at a certain point, Democrats are going to have to propose something, aren't they?
The Democrats literally have nothing to propose. They're just proposing it behind closed doors because it is very politically dangerous to propose very controversial things that involve spending cuts or tax increases by yourself, because the other side is going to beat you around the head. So I think the Democrats have shown, and they're planning to go to the left who are not happy about this development, that they are willing to do some sort of deal to ensure that the debt limit will be increased, and whether that involves some specific cuts in spending or increases in tax revenue, or whether it involves some kind of trigger proposal where it's not laid out in advance, but there's pressure on you to figure it out soon enough. I expect that's going to happen. You're not going to. There's been enough talk from even Republican leadership that a failure to increase the debt limit would be so economically disastrous that no one wants to risk being blamed for such a debacle. So I'm not terribly concerned that we're going to have that kind of apocalyptic moment. But your other point that the overall economy could end up being more important than this Medicare vote is certainly possible, depending on where the economy is going to be. generally speaking, if the economy keeps getting better and better by 2012, there's probably very little Republicans could do to beat Obama. If there's a double-dip recession, then Obama's probably in very bad straits unless Republicans pick somebody who's completely unacceptable. But if where the debt issue comes into play, I think, is more secondary, that if the economy is bad, you can point to the debt as evidence of economic mismanagement, even though those two things are actually separate. If the economy is getting better, the Medicare vote is an example of, let's not go back to the failed ideas of the past when the ideas that Obama is doing are showing to work. So they're both sort of secondary things, and the nature of the economy is arguably the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. And political scientists for the last few decades would agree with you. The economy is the most important thing anyway. Well, this was not the only fun and games in Congress this week. There's the Elizabeth Warren appeared in front of a House committee the other day, and this is a topic that you said there's plenty of on the left, correct?
Yeah, I think I brought this up with I think I brought up Con Carroll on some blogging heads, with Connor Friedsdorf on blogging heads, and I always get back from the right, we're not talking about this. We're not talking about Elizabeth Warren. No one thinks this is a big issue. And on the left, it's one of the big issues. Mm-hmm. If only Obama gets fully behind Elizabeth Warren, that proves he is the same Obama he was in the campaign. He's a true progressive champion. He's really sticking it to Wall Street. And if he doesn't do that, then he is proving that he is in the pocket of Wall Street and is not serious about real reform. So there's this real steady pressure put on the White House on these things. And the last time we went round on this, the White House dealt with it by appointing Warren to a Treasury position that did not require Senate confirmation and delayed the issue on who should be formally nominated to head the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and that is the agency at issue here that was set up in the Wall Street Reform Bill. It was Elizabeth Warren's idea, and so she's often seen as the best person to shape it and lead it. So she was given the task of setting it up without Senate confirmation, but now there's a deadline in the bill. Someone has to be picked by July 21st. And for a bit, there wasn't a big push about having Warren lead it, because when she was named for this interim position, it was said, well, she doesn't want to run it in full anyway. She just wants to set it up. She's not angling for a long-term commitment here. But earlier this month, the bulk of the Senate Republican caucus said, we're not going to accept anybody to this position unless you pass a series of changes to how this bureau is constructed, which the left is arguing would essentially gut the whole purpose of this bureau. So that has sparked calls on the progressive side. My group, Campaign for America's Future, has one of, I believe, 3 petition efforts out right now saying the Senate goes into recess at the end of this week. If the Republicans are being completely recalcitrant and they're not going to accept anybody, you have no obligation to find some acceptable compromise choice. Pick the best person. Elizabeth Warren's the best person. Do it as a recess appointment. You have all constitutional authority and civic obligation to do so. So our petition came out late last week. And at the same time, there was some House Democrats circulating a Dear Colleague letter also calling for the same. So when she had a pre-scheduled testimony appearance in front of the House Subcommittee, this is Congressman Patrick McHenry's House Oversight Subcommittee, it seemed as if the Republicans were looking to try to embarrass her and trip her up to lower the chances she would get picked for a recess appointment, to the point where it appears, and I'm sure conservatives will challenge me on this, and we don't know all the facts here, but it appears that the Republican staff kept changing the time of when the hearing was supposed to happen, and Warren was saying, look, I can only stay for a limited time. I have other meetings today. There appears to have been some, from Warren's standpoint, there was some verbal agreement that the hearing would end at 2:15 so she could have these other meetings. But then when 2:15 came at the hearing, Patrick Henry professed ignorance of all this and seemed to want to goad Warren into leaving the hearing before it was formally adjourned so they could accuse her of snubbing the committee, of imperiousness, of not wanting to submit to real oversight, yada, yada, yada. And this has led to, as the Daily Kos summed this up, David Waldman, pointing out that Patrick McHenry's office voicemail was overflowing. His Facebook page was crammed with angry denunciations of his petulance. People started making computer animations to show how shocked Warren was at this turn of events.
I saw the GIF file and one of the links that you sent, and I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. She's got this total face of like, excuse me?
Right.
You did not just say that.
Right.
Like, I'll find reasons to use this in emails to friends, I'm sure.
Right. David Dan at Fire Dog Lake tweeted, people are surprised McHenry called Warren a liar. So he basically said she was making stuff up about this issue of the scheduling. And Diane said, McHenry called her a liar in his prepared testimony. So the fact he would add to that in extemporaneous remarks was not shocking. So there's definitely an attempt to try to besmirch her reputation through all this. And what strikes me as sort of odd about the strategy is, one, she seems to have a very strong reputation in the eyes of the media already. She's not a Democrat by birth. She's a former Republican. She is seen as someone who's for a very non-ideological position of transparency in financial products. And she's been easing opposition amongst the banks to the point where one banker in Oklahoma, who heads one of the bank lobbies, who had called her akin to the Antichrist, is now actively campaigning for a recess appointment, saying, "Hey, we've worked with her, and she's shown herself to be, a fair official." So you don't have a lot of institutional support for what conservative Republicans are doing, yet they seem to be out on a limb on it. And from what you're telling me, they're not even getting a lot of conservative blogosphere backup because the conservatives aren't even taking this as a major issue to focus on. Right.
So when originally, I knew that this was happening. I had heard about it, saw it on Twitter. There's a post Ed Morrissey at Hot Air wrote about this, where he's not necessarily tearing into Warren as a person or the role of the board or anything. The basic point of his post is congressional hearings sometimes take time, and that's how government works, and, sorry you had other meetings to go to. This is literally what the post says. It says, "I'm sorry Ms. Warren feels inconvenienced, but perhaps you might want to take a civics course to understand the separation of powers and checks and balances in the federal system. Congress gets to hold hearings on operations in the executive branch, and they're not required to put a time limit on their inquiries, especially a 1-hour limit that barely gets by the opening marks in most committee hearings." So it wasn't even like a personal, it's mostly just like, when you're dealing with Congress, you can't really say, I'm sorry, I have to be somewhere else. You should have told me a different time. It's not really ideological. I guess it's just basically, to what extent do you think Congress is allowed to or not allowed to follow a set schedule?
Now, if you watch the hearing, I don't know if you happened to see it.
I saw clips of it. I did not see the whole thing.
By the time they got to the end, first off, the questions she was being asked weren't great attempts at real oversight. It was mostly a lot of posturing. But when they got to the end of that hour, there were no other Republicans there to ask her questions, and so McHenry was trying to get her to wait until they came back, and it was only when one of the Democrats, I think it was Congressman Cummings, said to McHenry, "Look, no one's even here right now. Why are you even trying to make her stay? It's not like there's some burning question someone's trying to ask and she's walking out in the middle of it." It was at that point where McHenry actually kind of flinched, and we basically did officially adjourn the meeting, so he didn't get the optic that he wanted for actually walking out before it was adjourned.
Yeah, I think at one point one of the lines that McHenry said was like, "The gentleman will simmer," something like that.
Right.
The only other post that I found really on this was like Robert Stacey McCain had a line in a post where he said, "Permit me to observe that if Obama is going to put Harvard law faculty in charge of economic policy, perhaps he should appoint some economists to the Justice Department, just to be fair." But that was kind of the only criticism that I saw. I went to a couple of the big blogs, I went to the Corner, and I don't like doing this for the show because I like to just read things and pull the stuff that I read and find things from various corners of the blogosphere. But I actually went to the search box and typed in Elizabeth Warren to see if anything would come up. Nothing. Nothing within the last week. So I said,
and do you know why that is? I know why the left cares about this issue so much, because people think that the Wall Street folks are the reason why the financial crisis happened, and if you don't actually clamp down on their behavior with not just good regulations but good regulators, you'll have a repeat.
Well, yeah, and I don't think think there's a big this is sort of the difference I think between the grassroots conservatism and establishment conservatism. If you want to say there's this big gulf there, is that establishment conservatives or, organizations are much more, kind of business friendly, whereas the bloggers who are out there, they don't have any interest in saying, like, yeah, Goldman Sachs, like, let's fight for them. So occasionally, if you go over to, Reason at Hit and Run, they've got guys who are, guys and girls who are writing posts about, why Elizabeth Warren's approach to consumer protection is wrong, and that it's babying people when people need to be accountable for reading documents before they sign them, and if that, even if my credit card agreement is 20 pages, I still basically know what's in it, and I know what my interest rate is, and I don't need the government babying me and giving me an elementary school version of it. That's the general gist of it, but it wasn't like anything this week jumping out saying, like, yeah, let's get rid of this CFAB board. So it's, I just think that there isn't a huge appetite in the conservative blogosphere to, like, stand up for banks and credit card companies.
Well, it's interesting because one of the charges that's been made towards McHenry, both by my Campaign for America's Future, our Future.org colleague Brian Dockstetter, he had a post called Why Elizabeth Warren Scares Republicans, and also I think one of the writers at Salon pointed out that McHenry gets a lot of bank donations. And even if this was sort of a futile battle to fight, he will, in theory, get more donations for having fought it, even than fighting the good fight and losing. So it doesn't matter that he doesn't have wingman support from conservative bloggers or from Fox News or whatever. His bank donors will know what he did, that he gave it his best shot, and he might reap the benefits from that. Now that's a cynical speculation. We'll see if that comes true. But I know that argument's being put out there.
Yeah, I think that's at the heart of why there hasn't been a lot of conservative frustration about this, is that there are other, I guess, bigger fish to fry on this one, or out there in terms of, shrinking government, the executive doing too many things, and what have you. This really has not gotten a lot of people bent out of shape.
Now, it seems that what got conservatives the most bent out of shape this past week was the president's Middle East speech at the end of last week, particularly his comments about the Israeli-Palestine conflict and his subsequent remarks to AIPAC. Would you say that's been the thing that they have flogged the most over the past few days?
Yes, and I almost feel I can't. This is the problem with me. I almost feel a little bad for President Obama in that the line. Are
you trying to destroy your career?
I know. I'm like, in the sense that his speech was 80% like something that George Bush could have given. It was like really freedom agenda, almost like neocon. Like we need to promote. It really was.
Well, and Bush himself, Bush Jr., did literally endorse a Palestinian state, which was the first president to do that.
And not even talking like the Israel-Palestine stuff. Like all the stuff around it about the Arab Spring was kind of a good, inoffensive speech. And then there was this chunk with the Israel-Palestine stuff where there were things, that there should be a Palestinian state. You even heard Netanyahu in his remarks to Congress say, like, I've told my people, yes, there will have to be a Palestinian state. Now it's time for Abbas to say, yes, there is a right for a Jewish state to exist. At any rate, I think the real hang-up is, so there's that 1967 line is what is like the biggest sort of flashpoint, because that was viewed as Obama setting the terms of negotiations and making the starting point, like that first offer, something that was not favorable toward Israel. Now, the argument against that is that, this had sort of always been the unofficial or, behind closed doors policy of the U.S., when it approached this conflict. The idea of the 1967 borders isn't something that was hugely foreign. That was where, that was sort of assumed. It was just unorthodox, one, that a president would come out and say it blatantly in this big major speech, and two, that it would happen. Apparently, there was not communication between the administration and Netanyahu's folks, so there was this element of surprise, and that is, so Jennifer Rubin at the Washington Post writes, there's a general agreement that his comments were a mistake. In a telephone interview today, Aaron David Miller, former Middle East negotiator who recently wrote critically of the religion of the peace process, went so far as to say there was no need to give that speech. Instead, Miller said it could have been given a week or two after the visit, throwing out the reference to the 1967 borders with no explanation or background was an error, especially since, in Miller's view, Obama violated the cardinal rule in dealing with Israel, no surprises. So that's become, like, I think the bigger... So one, there's people who think 67 borders is not a good starting place. Why would you come out and say that? And there are others who say, even if that was our policy, why did you have to spring that on him right before he's getting on the plane to come to the United States? It sort of set things up to be a tenser visit than was necessary.
Now, you have obviously different reactions, from on the left on this, although I hesitate to even call this one blogger on the left, Jeffrey Goldberg from The Atlantic, who is someone that a lot of folks on the left have criticized as being too conservative on Israeli issues. I mean, but at a minimum, you certainly can't call him any way half-hearted in his support for the Israeli state. He had a post entitled, "Why are Republicans misreading Obama's speech?" Okay, I guess it's a stupid question. Republicans are misreading Obama's speech for short-term political gain. But they're doing the cause they ostensibly support Israel a disservice in the process, because President Obama's speech was enthusiastically pro-Israel. I don't mean pro-Israel merely in the he's speaking hard truths the Israelis must hear about the occupation of their countries to survive as a Jewish democracy sort of way. I mean it was pro-Israel in a red meat, I hurt Israel, damn Hamas, Iraq can go to hell, Israel is the eternal Jewish state sort of way. Going on to say, Obama didn't insist that Israel return to its 1967 borders. He said the borders should form the basis of negotiations, and that Israel and Palestine should swap land that would bring settlement blocks and East Jerusalem Jewish neighborhoods into Israeli proper. And then goes on to criticize Romney's statement that Obama threw Israel under the bus. Goldberg then says, top officials of the Israeli Defense Ministry have been telling me and other reporters for a couple of years now that military cooperation between their country and America has never been countries that would like to be thrown under the similar buses. And now he went on to criticize Netanyahu for overreacting to the speech as well, and suggesting that he was hurting his own status, his own positioning by doing that. Matthew Iglesias had a more cynical take of what Netanyahu is doing, saying that Netanyahu knows exactly what he's doing, that he essentially doesn't really want to have a final settlement with the Palestinians. If you really and truly on the merits don't want to make substantial concessions to the Palestinians, everything you're doing makes sense. And he points out that if you go to some of the settlements, they are very well developed and they have useful infrastructure, and it would not be a very easy thing for those folks to want to give up very cavalierly. I think Iglesias wants them to give it up, but he's saying you could understand from their perspective why they would not want to at this point. And so that's where Netanyahu is coming from, that his actions make a whole lot more sense. So there's that debate going on, what's Netanyahu's thinking in all this. But you also have folks who've been always more critical of Obama from a foreign policy perspective, particularly Glenn Greenwald, who labeled the speech as essentially ineffectual and not a serious move to spark a peace agreement, citing Jeffrey Goldberg's reaction as evidence that even the Likudniks think it was a good speech, obviously did nothing to back away from Israel and move towards a more honest broker position. And Jonathan Chait sort of mocked that, saying, that's why Netanyahu and his supporters are apoplectic, because Obama's speech was so insignificant. Is it possible that Jeffrey Goldberg, while well to the right of Greenwald, also differs with Netanyahu? That's sort of premise to make Greenwald's brittle mind shatter if he tried to process it. So there's some of the invective going between different corners of the broader political progressive blogosphere.
In general, the conservative blogosphere is pretty united in enthusiastic support for Netanyahu. There was, again, going to Twitter, my Twitter feed was full of, Bibi 2012, can he run for president here, sorts of, enthusiasm. And his speech was well received by Congress. You had folks on both sides of the aisle standing frequently.
Do they hate America so much that they're now asking for foreigners to run our country?
Where's the birth certificate?
It's appalling.
So you have, an example of a post is Daniel Horowitz at Red State. Quote, Obama doubled down on his demand that Israel return to indefensible borders by creating a contiguous Palestinian state. As such, he continued to display his ignorance of the geographical reality that a contiguous Hamas-Fatah state bordering Jordan and Egypt, as stipulated in both speeches, means a non-contiguous Israel. And then he goes on to later say, unfortunately, AIPAC, AIPAC being sort of the major American-Israel Association, unfortunately, AIPAC has been run by hardcore Democrats for years. Recently, as support for Israel among Democrats has taken a nosedive, AIPAC leaders have taken it upon themselves to ensconce this inconvenient truth by providing cover for Democrats. In recent years, Republican support for Israel has hovered around 80 to 85%, while Democrat support has slipped as low as 48, according to Gallup. This is a question that Gallup throws out there where I think it says, like, who do you sympathize with more, Israelis or Palestinians? That's a crude wording of the question, but I believe that's the basic thrust of it. Making the point that, yes, this was a bipartisan group of people that were standing for the speech, and you had even folks like Harry Reid coming out in his speech, in his remarks to AIPAC, saying, that there, you can't have borders as preconditions for the negotiation. Harry Reid almost issued a statement that was seen by some conservatives as like a rebuke to Obama's. But even beyond the 1967 borders line, Jennifer Rubin points readers to a post by Alan Dershowitz at Huffington Post, where he's talking about that he says, quote, "There's an underlying flaw in Obama's thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is in reference to Obama laying out, here are 4 things you need to do. You need to figure out the status of Jerusalem. You need to figure out the status, right to return. You need to figure out the borders." He goes through this list of things you need to figure out. And the way the statement is worded, it sounds like you need to figure out the borders. And then once you get the borders figured out, then you figure out the really sore things like right to return. What do you do about Israel, or what do you do about Jerusalem? And Dershowitz's main point is that there's no way that his quote, "There's no way Israel can agree to borders without the Palestinians also agreeing to give up on any claim of a right to return. As Palestinian Prime Minister Fayyad Salam once told me, each side has a major card to play and a major compromise to make. For Israel, that card is the West Bank, and the compromise is returning to the 1967 lines with agreed-upon adjustments and swaps. For the Palestinian, that card is right of return, and the compromise is an agreement that Palestinian refugees will settle in Palestine and not in Israel. In other words, that there is no right to return to Israel." And that the way Obama has constructed this is he's basically saying that Israel's card to play should be a precondition of the negotiations, whereas Palestine had the Palestinian major card to play is something to be figured out later, and that puts Israel on the defense. But reacting to the Iglesias piece, there's another piece by Iglesias that was all about, why do we consider Israel to be our best friend? There's a line in the speech when Netanyahu says, that Israel has been America's greatest ally, and will continue to be America's greatest ally, or something to that effect. And Noah Millman over at the American Scene sort of tries to dig into this a little bit. He says, Iglesias says in his piece that Israel does nothing for America, that Israel is a burden and nothing more. This isn't entirely true. Israel has, for example, proved a useful partner in intelligence gathering in the past, helped battlefield test American weapons back when we weren't fighting so many wars ourselves, and was a useful proxy for undertaking certain unsavory tasks. But against this must be set Israel's repeated violations of basic rules of friendship, and then goes on to acknowledge things that Israel has done that have not been so friendly to us. Gives a list of those, and says, by most objective measures, Israel is not our best friend. Myself, I'd bestow that title on the same country Iglesias does, Canada, whose friendship we almost take entirely for granted. But Israel is a unique kind of friend for America, a friend that provides us psychic benefits that we really cannot get from any other country, in that, Canada's not an embattled state, a shining beacon of democracy in the midst of chaos, and that's why America looks, and that's why you get such a strong pro-Israel reaction from so many politicians, because it feels good to support Israel, because they are, if you want to say good guys versus bad guys, they weren't the ones cheering in the streets on September 11th, so that's why what he's talking about when he says that our friends that Israel provides us with psychic benefits that we really cannot get from any other country. Is why he sees that's a huge reason why you see this really united conservative and beyond the conservative world, bipartisan, huge support for Israel.
I just want to go back to that Dershowitz post for a second, because Jonathan Chait in the Republic had an interesting retort to that. He had 3 criticisms with the Dershowitz post. One, Dershowitz assumes that Netanyahu actually wants to negotiate a 2-state settlement with the Palestinians. This assumption is unproven at best. That's a link with what Iglesias said previously. Second, this is more what you were focusing on. Dershowitz simply assumes that a maximalist negotiating posture is the strongest, and that Israel can't strengthen its position by appearing reasonable, enticing Palestinians to negotiate and or make Palestinians look unreasonable if they refuse to do so. Sometimes this holds true, but sometimes it doesn't. And this is something analogous to, I think, what a lot of liberal criticism of Obama is, like, why didn't you put single payer on the table first and negotiate back from there? Why didn't you put capping the size of banks first and negotiate from that point? And something I think sometimes that negotiating works, and sometimes you plant your flag so far afield that you get laughed out of the room. You'll go into salary negotiation situation saying, give me $1 million, hoping you're going to get 500,000, when more likely you're going to get something like 70 or 80. So there's that issue. And then finally, and this is one part about this, why did Obama do any of this stuff? Why did Obama semantically tweak the stating of our position about negotiations? And Chait says, Dershowitz doesn't even take into account that the U.S. need to establish some international credibility in order to defend Israel at the UN if and when the Palestinians unilaterally declare a state. Not only does the U.S. need credibility, but Israel needs the U.S. to have that credibility. And this arguably is a subtext to all this stuff that I think Jeffrey Goldberg mentioned this too, that Obama I think he said flat out that he does not want the Palestinians to petition the UN and say, just declare us a state. Screw these negotiations. Just say we're a state and give us a seat at the UN, because that could scramble the prospects for a long-term negotiation settlement too. So, can he give the Palestinians, a little crumb, a little semantic crumb that doesn't actually change what our substantive posture is, in exchange for having additional credibility to go to other countries and say, look, I know you're frustrated with this whole deal. I know this is going on for 5 decades, but don't flinch right now, because having them unilaterally declare states is going to be bad news, going forward. You could still suggest that Obama is wrong, or that he's negotiating poorly, as Dershowitz is saying, or what have you. But I think it's generally fair to at least acknowledge he may have a reason. he may not disagree with your goal, but may have a different strategic and tactical sense how to get to that goal that doesn't jive with where you're at, and it doesn't make him a bad guy. It just means you have a disagreement.
I think the other major reason why you see so much criticism of the idea that Obama would give the Palestinians any sort of foothold from which to spring from is this. Well, is the Fatah-Hamas sort of alliance that you've got going on now too, where, Hamas is a group that, they came out and said that they were upset that we killed Osama bin Laden. I think the Palestinians have a big problem in that so long as Hamas remains, in coalition or holding hands with Fatah, I think that there's going to be it makes it very difficult for the United States or for President Obama to give a crumb to the Palestinians, and I think justifiably.
Why don't we leave it on that note?
Okay.
Always good to talk to you, Kristen.
Always good to talk to you too, Bill.
And we'll do it again in a couple of weeks. Next week we'll have our friend Matt Lewis back. And where can folks find your work?
KristenSoltis.com is the best hub for all of it.
Excellent. You can find my stuff at ourfuture.org and liberaloasis.com. Interview with the fiery cartoonist Ted Rall on the show today. Him and I have a little tete-a-tete over his column, The Rise of the Obama Bots. If you're interested in that, that'll be up on liberaloasis.com this weekend. So we'll see you next week, and that'll do it for this week in Blog. Take care.